A 10-year-old boy sat in the defendant's chair. His feet swung back and forth, not quite reaching the floor. His legs moved with the casual rhythm of childhood, with the kind of automatic motion that came from being too small for the furniture around him. The courtroom was silent. The verdict was about to be read. Everyone in the room understood that they were about to witness something important, something that would determine the course of a young life and acknowledge the death of another human being. The judge opened his mouth to speak, and in that precise moment, the boy yawned. Not a small yawn, not a covered yawn, a wide, open, audible yawn. The kind of yawn that a child makes when they are tired or bored or completely disconnected from the weight of the moment they are experiencing. He stretched his arms. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hands. He looked around the courtroom as though he had just woken up from a nap and was mildly curious about where he was. And in that single gesture, a 10-year-old boy revealed something so fundamental about himself that it would change how the judge approached the sentencing. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't measure children by their age. It measures them by their actions. If you believe that accountability matters, subscribe now and tell us what you think in the comments below. Let's look at how a moment of indifference became the turning point in a case that challenged everything we thought we knew about childhood and conscience. Before the yawn, there was a life, a person who existed in the world. A person who had family and friends and routines and a future that seemed normal and certain. The victim was someone from the neighborhood, not famous, not wealthy, not particularly remarkable in any obvious way, except for being a person who deserved to continue living. The boy who would be accused of killing this person was 10 years old. He was small. He was in elementary school. He had friends. He had a family. He had people who loved him and wanted the best for him. No one suspected what he was capable of. No one imagined that this child, this ordinary boy from an ordinary family in an ordinary neighborhood, had something dark developing inside him. Something that would eventually express itself in an act of violence so serious that it would bring him into a courtroom, would put him in front of a judge, would put him on trial for murder. The path from being a normal 10-year-old to being accused of killing someone seemed impossible. And yet, that path had been taken. That line had been crossed. And now a child sat in a courtroom wearing restraints, and the system had to determine how to respond. The judge sat elevated on his bench, commanding the space through architecture and centuries of legal tradition. His name was William Hartford. He had been a judge for 28 years. He had presided over hundreds of cases involving both adults and juveniles. He had developed a kind of institutional knowledge about how the justice system worked, about how people responded under stress, about how criminals behaved when they were confronted with the reality of their crimes. He had seen terror. He had seen defiance. He had seen remorse, and he had seen its absence. But he had rarely, if ever, seen what he was about to witness. The jury had just filed back into the box. They had deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, wrestling with the question of guilt and innocence in a case where the evidence was overwhelming, but the defendant was a child. The jury foreperson stood when asked if they had reached a verdict. She said that they had. The judge asked them to read the verdict. The foreperson opened the verdict form. Her hands were shaking slightly. She had been carrying the weight of this decision for 3 days. 3 days of trying to reconcile the evidence with the defendant's age. 3 days of trying to determine what justice meant in a case where a 10-year-old was accused of murdering a neighbor. The victim's family sat in the gallery. The mother had her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The father sat with his arm around her. Their adult children sat beside them. They were all leaning forward slightly, all focused on the foreperson, all waiting for the words that would determine whether their family's killer would be held accountable. The defendant's family sat on the other side of the courtroom. The mother looked exhausted. The father's expression was impossible to read. They were separated from the victim's family by the geography of the courtroom, but they were connected by the terrible event that had brought them all together. The foreperson began to speak. Her voice was steady, but quiet. The bailiff asked her to speak louder. She repeated herself. The charges were read. The verdict was guilty. The word hung in the air like it was suspended by invisible threads. Guilty. The victim's mother put her hand over her mouth. Some family members began to cry. The defendant's mother made a sound that was something between a sob and an expression of disbelief. And then, in that moment when the courtroom was filled with the weight of the verdict, when silence should have settled over everything, when the appropriate response would have been to absorb the gravity of what had just been declared, the boy yawned. It was not a small covered yawn. It was a full, open-mouthed yawn. The kind of yawn that a child makes when they are tired, when they are bored, when they are completely disconnected from what is happening around them. The boy's mouth opened wide, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. He yawned with the kind of unselfconscious ease that only children can manage. Then he opened his eyes. He rubbed them with the back of his hands like he had just woken up from a nap. He looked around the courtroom with an expression of mild curiosity, as though he was wondering where he was, as though the proceedings he had been sitting through for the past 3 weeks were of no particular importance to him. The courtroom erupted. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some people stood up involuntarily. Some people began to speak. The victim's mother made a sound that was half gasp, half cry. The judge's expression changed. It shifted from the controlled neutrality that judges maintain to something else entirely. Something that looked like anger. Something that looked like shock. Something that looked like a recognition that he was witnessing something that violated the basic protocols of how a courtroom should function. The judge raised his hand. The courtroom began to quiet. The judge's gavel came down once, hard. The sound echoed through the space. The judge looked directly at the boy. His expression was clear. His anger was evident. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked at the child who sat in front of him, the child who had just been found guilty of murder, the child who had yawned as though the entire proceedings were beneath his attention, as though the verdict that had just been read held no significance, as though the family that was grieving on the other side of the courtroom was irrelevant. And then the judge spoke. He said that what had just occurred in his courtroom was unprecedented. He said that the gesture that the boy had made, the yawn, the rubbing of his eyes, the apparent complete indifference to the verdict, revealed something about the defendant's character that was deeply troubling. He said that it demonstrated a level of disconnection from reality that suggested a young person who was incapable of understanding the impact of his actions on others. Before the yawn, there was a man. His name was Robert Thompson. He was 45 years old. He had lived in the same neighborhood for 18 years. He had purchased his house when the real estate market was different, when he had believed he was settling in a place where he would build a life, raise a family, grow old. The marriage that was supposed to last forever had ended in divorce 10 years earlier. The children that were supposed to fill the house had grown up and moved away. But Robert had stayed. He had stayed in the house. He had stayed in the neighborhood. He had built a quiet life that was structured by routine and marked by the kind of peace that comes from knowing your place in a community. His routine was the framework of his existence. He went to work in the morning at a local hospital where he worked as an administrator. He supervised a team of 20 people. He was responsible for making sure that the hospital's operations ran smoothly, that patients were treated with respect, that the systems that had been put in place were maintained and improved. He was good at his job. He was respected by his colleagues. He was the kind of person that people could count on, that people could depend on, that people could trust to do what he said he would do. He came home in the evening exhausted, but satisfied. He would sometimes have dinner with neighbors. He would sometimes sit on his porch and watch the neighborhood settle into evening. The neighborhood where Robert lived was typical of suburban communities across America. The houses were built in the 1980s. They were similar in design and construction. The yards were similar in size. The people who lived there were people who worked. They had jobs that required them to be somewhere specific at a specific time. They had families, or they lived alone. They had mortgages. They had responsibilities. They had chosen this neighborhood because it seemed safe, because it seemed stable, because it seemed like the kind of place where you could build a quiet life without being bothered by the chaos of the outside world. Robert was woven into the fabric of this neighborhood in a way that was quiet but significant. He was the man who would help neighbors with projects around their homes. He was the man who would check on elderly neighbors when he hadn't seen them in a while. He was the man who would remember to ask about someone's sick parent or struggling child. He was not a close friend to anyone in particular, but he was a person that everyone knew, that everyone respected, that everyone felt comfortable approaching if they needed help with something. He was the kind of person who made a community feel stable and secure. The 10-year-old who lived 6 houses down the street knew Robert, but not in any meaningful sense. They had waved at each other on the street. They had exchanged pleasantries at neighborhood gatherings. There was no conflict between them. There was no known tension or animosity. Robert had no reason to suspect that this child was dangerous. The boy had no reason to harbor resentment toward Robert. They existed in the same neighborhood, but their lives did not intersect in any significant way. Or at least that was what everyone believed before the night that changed everything. The evening of his death, Robert had called his sister. They maintained a close relationship. They spoke frequently to check in, to share updates about their lives, to maintain the connection that had been forged in childhood and had survived the challenges of adulthood. In that phone call, Robert had mentioned that he was thinking about taking a trip. He had mentioned that he was considering volunteering more at the hospital. He had mentioned that he was thinking about his future, about what his life would look like in the coming years. He had sounded content. He had sounded like a man who was satisfied with his life, who had made peace with the choices he had made, who had found happiness even though things hadn't worked out the way he had initially planned. That phone call would be the last conversation his sister would have with him. That conversation would be preserved in her memory forever. She would remember his voice. She would remember the topics they discussed. She would remember the sense that he was looking forward to the future, that he had things to look forward to, that his life was moving in a positive direction. Later, after his death, she would think about that conversation frequently. She would think about the things he had mentioned, the trip he would never take, the volunteer work he would never do. The future that had seemed so certain and so present in his words would be erased by a single act of violence committed by a child from the neighborhood. The discovery occurred at 7:37 in the morning. A neighbor noticed that Robert's newspaper was still on the driveway. The neighbor had known Robert for years and understood his habits. Robert always brought his newspaper inside before he left for work. The newspaper being on the driveway suggested that something was unusual. The neighbor approached the house and looked through the front window. What she saw made her immediately call emergency services. The police arrived within minutes. The first responders noted that the house was quiet. There was no sound of struggle. There was no indication of chaos or violence. The living room was orderly. The television was off. There were no signs of forced entry. The door had been unlocked. The boy had been able to simply walk inside. The body was in the living room, positioned as though the person had been going about their evening routine when something had interrupted them. The medical examiner noted that the time of death was consistent with the evening before, with the time when the neighborhood was settling into sleep, with the time when most people were inside their homes and doors were locked. The crime scene investigators moved through the space with methodical precision. They photographed everything. They documented the absence of forced entry. They noted that the door had been unlocked, that the boy had been able to simply knock and be allowed inside. They collected evidence. They took measurements. They noted the position of the body. They observed the absence of defensive wounds, the absence of evidence that Robert had tried to fight back. The crime scene suggested that the violence had been sudden and overwhelming. that there had been no opportunity for resistance, that what had happened quickly and completely. A security camera on a house across the street had captured footage of a small figure approaching Robert's house at 6:45 in the evening. The figure was wearing dark clothes. The figure was moving with purpose. The figure was not hesitant or fearful. The figure was walking as though going to an expected destination. The figure had arrived at Robert's house and had been inside for approximately 30 minutes before leaving. When the figure emerged from the house, the clothing appeared different. The footage was not clear enough to see specific details, but the investigators noted that something had changed. Something about the way the figure was moving suggested that something significant had occurred inside the house. The neighborhood that had seemed so safe, so secure, so peaceful, had suddenly become something else. A place where violence had occurred. A place where a man had been killed. A place where a child had apparently walked in the evening light to commit an act that defied comprehension. The neighbors learned what had happened through police activity. They learned through the presence of police cars and forensic teams and emergency vehicles. They learned through the gathering of official authority on their quiet street. And they learned, slowly and with growing horror, that the person who had committed this act was someone from the neighborhood, someone they knew, someone's child, a 10-year-old. The investigation began immediately. The evidence was preserved. The body was removed. The house was sealed as a crime scene, and the focus of the investigation turned toward identifying and locating the person who had been captured on the security camera, toward understanding who had killed Robert Thompson, and why, toward answering the question that seemed almost impossible to answer. Why would a 10-year-old child kill his neighbor? The boy was brought in for questioning 2 hours after police had identified him as the person in the security camera footage. He was accompanied by his mother and a lawyer that she had immediately contacted. The boy was placed in an interrogation room with 2 detectives. One detective was a woman named Catherine Morrison, who had been interviewing suspects for 20 years. The other was a man named David Chen, who had specialized in interviewing juveniles suspected of serious crimes for the past 15 years. They were experienced at understanding how children responded to questioning, how they constructed narratives, how they sometimes revealed more through what they didn't say than through what they did say. The boy was small for his age. His feet didn't touch the ground when he sat in the chair. A booster seat had been placed on the chair to elevate him slightly. His hands rested on the table in front of him. His mother sat next to him. The lawyer sat on his other side. The detectives sat across from him. They explained his rights. They explained that he was not under arrest, but that they wanted to talk to him about what had happened. The boy said that he understood. His voice was calm. His demeanor was composed. He did not appear nervous or frightened. He appeared, if anything, almost curious about the proceedings, as though he was interested in how the interview would unfold. Detective Morrison asked the boy where he had been the evening before. The boy said that he had been at home. He said that he had spent the evening in his room. He said that he had not left the house. The detectives noted that this statement contradicted the security camera footage. They did not immediately confront him with the contradiction. Instead, they asked additional questions designed to establish a timeline. The boy provided details about what he had watched on television. He provided details about what he had eaten. He provided details that were designed to establish his presence at home during the time of the crime. But his responses had a quality to them that suggested rehearsal. His responses sounded as though they had been practiced. His responses sounded like he had prepared them in advance, like he had thought about what he would say if he was ever questioned. His phrasing was sometimes too adult, sometimes using language that seemed unusual for a 10-year-old to use. Detective Chen asked about his relationship with Robert Thompson. The boy said that he didn't really know him. The boy said that they had waved at each other occasionally, but had never had a real conversation. The boy said that he had no reason to have any conflict with Robert. The boy said that he had nothing to do with what happened to Robert. As he was saying all of this, the boy's demeanor remained calm. He did not appear nervous. He did not appear frightened. He did not appear to be experiencing the kind of anxiety that would be typical of a 10-year-old who was being questioned by detectives about a murder. Instead, he appeared almost bored. He appeared to be answering questions as a requirement, as though the interview was a task that needed to be completed, but that held no particular emotional significance for him. The detectives looked at each other. They had both interviewed hundreds of suspects. They had developed an instinct about when someone was telling the truth and when someone was lying. And their instinct told them, clearly and unambiguously, that this boy was lying. Detective Morrison showed him the security camera footage. She asked him to look at the image of a small figure wearing clothes similar to what he was wearing, walking toward Robert's house at the time of the murder. The boy looked at the footage and said that it wasn't him. He said that it must be another kid from the neighborhood. He said that the footage was unclear and could be anyone. The detectives asked him if he would be willing to provide his clothing from the evening so that they could compare it to what was shown in the video. The boy's mother conferred with the lawyer. The lawyer advised his client not to cooperate with the request. The interrogation continued for another hour, but no additional information was obtained beyond the boy's repeated denials of involvement. When the interrogation concluded, the detectives had one clear understanding. The boy was lying. His statements did not match the video evidence. His timeline did not align with the information they had obtained from neighbors and forensic evidence. His appearance matched what was shown in the security camera footage. But the detectives also understood that lying during an interrogation is not the same as being guilty of a crime. They had to build a case based on evidence. They had to prove their suspicion through forensic investigation and physical evidence. The interrogation was over, but the investigation was just beginning. The boy was released to his mother's custody, but he was told not to leave the jurisdiction. He was told that further questioning would be necessary. He was told that the investigation was continuing. The digital forensics team began their work immediately after the boy's interrogation. They collected data from the boy's phone. They examined his location history. They looked at his search history. They reviewed his text messages and any communications he had with other children his age. What they discovered was a digital trail that corroborated the security camera footage and contradicted everything the boy had said during his interrogation. The boy's phone location data showed his phone at his house in the afternoon. The data showed his phone moving through the neighborhood in the evening, arriving at Robert's house at exactly 6:45 in the evening, and then returning to his house at 7:17 in the evening. The data was consistent with the time of the murder based on the medical examiner's preliminary estimate. The data was consistent with the security camera footage. The data definitively placed the boy at Robert's house at the time of Robert's death. There was no possibility of error. There was no possibility of coincidence. The boy had been at Robert's house when Robert was killed. The clothing that the boy had been wearing when he left his house matched the clothing shown in the security camera footage. The shoes that he had been wearing matched shoe prints that investigators had photographed near Robert's house. The forensic evidence was accumulating quickly. Every piece of physical evidence seemed to point in the same direction. Every detail seemed to confirm what the detectives had already begun to suspect, that the boy had killed Robert Thompson. The boy's phone search history was examined. He had searched for information about how to disable security cameras. He had searched for information about crime scenes. He had searched for information about juvenile justice. He had searched for information about murder. The searches had been conducted weeks before the crime. The searches suggested premeditation. The searches suggested that the boy had been thinking about committing violence, had been planning something, had been preparing himself mentally for an act of violence. The searches were documented. The searches were added to the growing file of evidence. Friends of the boy were interviewed. Some had noticed that he had been acting strangely in the days before the crime. Some had noticed that he had been talking about wanting to do something that would make him famous, something that would make him stand out, something that would make him important. Some had mentioned that the boy had spoken about wanting to hurt someone, about wanting to understand what violence felt like. These statements were documented. These statements were added to the growing file of evidence. A picture was beginning to emerge of a child who was obsessed with violence, who fantasized about committing crimes, who wanted to experience the attention that came from committing serious acts. The boy's mother was interviewed. She said that her son had seemed troubled lately. She said that he had been struggling at school. She said that he had been having difficulty with his peer relationships. She said that he had expressed frustration with his life and his circumstances. She said that she had tried to help him, tried to talk to him, tried to understand what was bothering him. But she also said that she had never imagined he was capable of violence. She had never suspected that he was planning to harm anyone. She had been shocked by the accusations, shocked by the evidence, shocked by the realization that her son might be capable of what the police were suggesting. The investigation moved forward methodically. The evidence accumulated with relentless consistency. The case that had seemed so uncertain immediately after the crime began to crystallize into something clear and undeniable. The boy had killed Robert Thompson. The why was less clear than the what and the how, but the basic facts were solid. The timeline was documented. The physical evidence was collected. The digital evidence was preserved. The forensic evidence was analyzed. The witness testimony was obtained. Every piece of the puzzle fit into place with precision. The system that seemed so uncertain in the beginning had found its answer. The answer was that a 10-year-old boy had killed his neighbor and then lied about it. The forensic report was thorough and devastating. The medical examiner had determined the cause of death. The manner of death was homicide. The time of death was consistent with the evening hours. The body had been in the living room, positioned in a way that suggested the violence had been sudden and overwhelming. There were no signs that Robert had attempted to fight back. There were no defensive wounds. The attack had been swift and complete. The forensic psychologist who reviewed the case noted that the absence of defensive injuries suggested that the victim had not perceived the threat, that he had trusted the person who came to his door, that he had had no reason to be afraid of a 10-year-old child. The shoe impressions found at the crime scene were compared to the shoes that the boy had been wearing. The comparison revealed multiple points of similarity. The wear pattern on the sole of the shoe, the specific marks and characteristics, the way that the shoe had been compressed and worn, all matched the impressions found at Robert's house. An expert testified that the probability of the shoe prints matching by random chance was less than 1 in 10,000. The evidence was clear. The shoes that the boy had worn had left the impressions at Robert's house. The fiber evidence was analyzed. Fibers from the boy's clothing matched fibers found on Robert's body. The DNA evidence was processed. Blood from Robert was found on the boy's clothing. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Every forensic test seemed to produce the same result. The boy had been at Robert's house. The boy had been in contact with Robert. The boy had been involved in Robert's death. The forensic evidence was not circumstantial. It was not subject to interpretation or dispute. It was clear and undeniable. The phone location data was reviewed in detail. An expert from the cellular provider explained how the location services on the boy's phone had tracked his movements. The data showed his phone at his house in the afternoon. The data showed his phone moving through the neighborhood in the evening, arriving at Robert's house, and then returning to his house. The data was consistent with the surveillance footage. The data corroborated every other piece of evidence. The timeline that had been established by the cameras was confirmed by the digital trail of the phone. The boy's location at the time of the crime was documented and undisputable. A forensic technician testified about the security of the phone data. The technician explained that the location services on modern smartphones provided precise information about location and movement. The technician explained that this information was automatically recorded and transmitted to the phone's manufacturer and the cellular provider. The technician explained that this information could not be manipulated or falsified. The technician explained that the data definitively proved that the boy's phone had been at Robert's house at the time of the crime. No question, no doubt, no possibility of error. The deleted search history was recovered. Deleted messages were recovered from the phone. The boy had sent text messages to friends discussing the crime. He had boasted about what he had done. He had described the experience in detached language that suggested no remorse or understanding of what he had caused. The messages were documented. The messages were presented to investigators. The messages were preserved as evidence. Each message was another brick in the wall that was being built against the boy. Each deletion, each attempt to cover his tracks, each piece of evidence that he had tried to hide was preserved and presented as proof of his guilt. A comprehensive psychological evaluation of the boy was ordered by the court. A psychologist named Dr. Elizabeth Morrison was assigned to interview the boy and assess his mental state, his capacity to understand the consequences of his actions, his understanding of right and wrong, his psychological profile, and risk factors. Dr. Morrison was a forensic psychologist who had spent 30 years conducting evaluations of juveniles suspected of serious crimes. She had interviewed hundreds of young people. She had learned to recognize patterns in behavior, in speech, in demeanor that suggested various psychological conditions and personality traits. The boy sat across from Dr. Morrison in an interview room. He maintained the same composure that he had displayed during the police interrogation. He answered questions directly and without apparent emotional response. When asked about his feelings regarding Robert's death, the boy said that he felt bad about it. But when asked to elaborate, when asked to explain what he felt bad about, the boy couldn't articulate a genuine emotional response. He said that he felt bad because people were upset. He said that he felt bad because the situation was difficult. But he did not express sadness about the loss of a human life. He did not express concern about Robert as a person. He did not display any of the normal emotional responses that would be expected from a 10-year-old who had killed someone. Dr. Morrison asked about the boy's interest in the media coverage of the case. The boy acknowledged that he had been following the news. The boy acknowledged that he was aware that the case was getting attention. When asked how he felt about that attention, the boy's response was telling. He said that he found it interesting. He said that he was curious to see how the case developed. He said that he wanted to know what people were saying about him. His focus seemed to be entirely on himself, on his own situation, on how the crime and its aftermath affected him, rather than on the loss of life or the impact on Robert's family. Dr. Morrison's assessment was completed and submitted to the court. She noted that the boy displayed characteristics consistent with what psychologists call a personality disturbance. She noted that the boy showed limited capacity for empathy. She noted that the boy seemed primarily focused on his own needs and interests. She noted that the boy's response to his own serious crime seemed more characterized by curiosity and indifference than by remorse or understanding. She noted that these characteristics suggested a level of psychological dysfunction that was particularly concerning in such a young child. The psychologist reported that the boy clearly understood the difference between right and wrong. He understood that killing was illegal. He understood that his actions had caused harm, but his understanding was purely intellectual. It did not translate into emotional recognition of the harm. It did not result in remorse or guilt. He understood the rules. He understood that he had violated them. But he did not care about the violation. He did not seem to understand why others cared. The psychologist concluded that the boy presented a significant risk for future violence and that his capacity for rehabilitation was questionable at best. The victim's family began to prepare for trial. Robert's sister was going to testify. Robert's nieces and nephews were going to testify. Robert's colleagues from the hospital were going to testify. They would all have the opportunity to tell the jury about who Robert was, about what he meant to them, about the loss they were experiencing. The prosecutor had asked them to prepare impact statements. These statements would be read to the jury, not as evidence of guilt or innocence, but as a way for the jury to understand the full impact of the crime, to understand who had been killed, to understand what had been lost. Robert's sister sat down one evening and began to write. She wrote about the years they had spent together. She wrote about growing up with Robert. She wrote about the person he had become. She wrote about the phone call on the evening before his death, about the conversation about the trip he wanted to take, and the volunteer work he wanted to do. She wrote about finding out that he was dead. She wrote about the shock and the grief and the disbelief. She wrote about the person Robert had been. She wrote about his quiet integrity, his reliability, his ability to make people feel cared for. She wrote about the future that had been taken from him. Robert's nieces and nephews wrote about their uncle. They wrote about growing up with him. They wrote about the ways he had been present in their lives. They wrote about the loss not just of their uncle, but of the future they had imagined with him. They wrote about the holidays that would never be the same. They wrote about the family gatherings that would always have an empty chair. They wrote about the children they might have had who would never know their great-uncle. Each member of Robert's family was processing their own grief, their own loss, their own sense of injustice about what had been taken from them. Meanwhile, the defendant's family was processing their own crisis. The boy's mother had to confront the reality of what her son had done. She had to process the shock of learning that her child was a murderer. She had to manage the grief of knowing that her son's actions had destroyed a family, that her son had taken a human life, that her son had apparently done it deliberately and with planning. She had to prepare to sit in court and watch her son be tried for murder. She had to prepare to face the family of the person her son had killed. She had to prepare to hear victim impact statements. She had to prepare to listen to her own child being described as a murderer. The trial would begin in 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, both families would prepare for what was to come. Both families would have to sit in the same courtroom, separated by an aisle, but connected by the terrible event that had brought them together. Both families would have to witness the legal proceedings. Both families would have to listen to evidence. Both families would have to hear the jury determine what had happened. The trial would be the center of their lives for the coming weeks. The trial would be the thing that they thought about when they woke up. The trial would be the thing that kept them awake at night. The prosecutor met with Robert's family. He explained the process. He explained what to expect. He explained that the trial would be difficult, that they would have to listen to the evidence being presented, that they would have to hear arguments about what had happened. He explained that the verdict would come at the end of the trial. He explained that if the defendant was found guilty, there would be a sentencing hearing where the judge would determine an appropriate punishment. He explained that the process would be long and difficult and painful. He explained that there was no way to make what had happened right, but that the justice system would do its best to acknowledge the loss and to hold the person responsible. The defense attorney met with the boy and his family. He explained that he would be arguing that the boy deserved consideration based on his age. He explained that while he would not deny that something serious had happened, he would argue that the boy's youth was a significant factor that should be weighed in his favor. He explained that the justice system, particularly for juveniles, was designed to emphasize rehabilitation rather than punishment. He explained that while the outcome was uncertain, he would do everything in his power to protect his client's interests and to argue for the lightest possible sentence. The trial began on a Monday morning in late autumn. The weather was cool and gray. The courtroom was filled with media and community members who had read about the case and wanted to see the 10-year-old boy who was accused of killing his neighbor. The gallery was crowded. The media section was full. The jury had been carefully selected through a process of questioning designed to determine if potential jurors could be fair and impartial despite the media coverage and the public interest in the case. The judge was a woman named Margaret Ashford. She had been a judge for 19 years. She had presided over hundreds of cases, including many involving juvenile defendants. She had developed a kind of institutional knowledge about how the justice system worked, about how people responded under stress, about how the law should be applied to young people who had committed serious crimes. She was respected by both prosecutors and defense attorneys. She was known for running a courtroom with strict rules and clear expectations. She did not tolerate disruption. She did not tolerate disrespect. She believed that the courtroom was a place where the law was applied fairly and consistently. The boy entered the courtroom. He was small. He was 10. He wore appropriate clothing. He was in restraints that connected his wrists to a chain around his waist. The restraints were necessary for security, but they were also symbolically significant. They announced to everyone in the courtroom that this boy was considered dangerous, that he was being held because he was suspected of a serious crime, that he was not a free person. He sat at the defense table next to his attorney. His mother was in the gallery behind him. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had not slept well, who was carrying a weight that was becoming unbearable, who was about to face the reality of what her son had done. The opening statements began. The prosecutor stood and addressed the jury. She outlined the evidence. She explained the timeline. She promised the jury that the evidence would be clear and overwhelming. She promised that when the trial concluded, they would have no doubt about the boy's guilt. She promised to prove that the defendant had killed Robert Thompson deliberately and with planning. The defense attorney stood and addressed the jury. He acknowledged that something terrible had happened. He asked the jury to consider the boy's age, his youth, his lack of prior criminal history. He argued that while the boy might have been involved in the incident, the circumstances were unclear and the evidence could be interpreted in different ways. It was a weak argument, but it was the best argument available to someone defending an indefensible case. The jury was sworn in. The trial began. The prosecution's first witness took the stand. The evidence began to accumulate. With each testimony, with each presentation of physical evidence, the case against the boy became clearer. The jury watched intently. The boy watched with apparent curiosity. Robert's family sat in the gallery and listened to the details of how their loved one had died. The trial that was expected to last 3 weeks began its slow progress toward a verdict that everyone in the courtroom already knew was coming. The surveillance footage was played for the jury. The video showed a small figure in dark clothes walking down a suburban street. The quality was clear enough that the general size and shape could be identified. The quality was clear enough that the clothing could be recognized. The video showed the boy walking toward Robert's house at 6:45 in the evening. The video showed him arriving at the front door. The video showed him departing at 7:17 in the evening. The timestamp was precise. The timeline was irrefutable. The jury watched the footage with the kind of focused attention that comes from understanding that they were watching evidence of a serious crime. A detective testified about the security camera footage. The detective explained the timeline. The detective explained how the footage corresponded to the estimated time of death. The detective explained that the clothing in the footage matched clothing found in the boy's room. The detective explained that the shoes in the footage matched shoes found at the crime scene. The evidence was systematic and undeniable. The jury took notes. Some jurors looked at the boy. Some jurors looked away. The message was clear. This boy had been at Robert's house at the time of the crime. Phone location data was presented. An expert from the cellular provider explained how the location services on the boy's phone had tracked his movements. The data showed his phone at his house in the afternoon. The data showed his phone moving through the neighborhood in the evening. The data showed his phone at Robert's house at the time of the crime. The data showed his phone returning to his house after the murder. The timeline was consistent. The data was undisputable. The expert testified that there was no possibility of error or manipulation. The data definitively placed the boy at Robert's house at the time of Robert's death. Forensic evidence was presented. A forensic technician testified about the physical evidence found at the crime scene. The technician explained that fibers from the boy's clothing had been found on Robert's body. The technician explained that shoe impressions found at the crime scene matched the shoes the boy had been wearing. The technician explained that blood from Robert had been found on the boy's clothing. The technician explained that the probability of all of this evidence being coincidental was essentially zero. The evidence was overwhelming. The medical examiner testified about the cause of death. The cause was blunt force trauma. The injuries were consistent with a violent assault. The injuries were consistent with the murder weapon that had been recovered. The time of death, based on the body's condition, was consistent with the evening hours, consistent with the time when the boy had been at Robert's house. The evidence was clinical, precise, and absolutely clear. Day after day, witness after witness took the stand. Day after day, piece after piece of evidence was presented. The defense attorney had few weapons to use against the overwhelming evidence. He cross-examined witnesses, but the witnesses' testimony remained consistent. He challenged the forensic evidence, but the forensic evidence was sound. He argued that his client deserved consideration based on his age, but the evidence of premeditation and planning suggested that age alone could not excuse what had been done. The boy sat at the defense table and watched the evidence mount against him. Slowly, over the course of the trial, his demeanor began to change. His initial composure began to crack. His certainty about his ability to escape the consequences began to erode. By the end of the prosecution's case, he looked less like a boy who was curious about the proceedings and more like a boy who was beginning to understand the gravity of his situation. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, wrestling with the question of guilt and innocence. 3 days of reviewing the forensic reports, the timeline, the phone data, the surveillance footage. 3 days of trying to determine whether the evidence was sufficient to convict a 10-year-old of murder. But there was little doubt about what the verdict would be. The evidence was too clear. The timeline was too precise. The physical evidence was too damning. Every juror understood what had to happen. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the jury sent a note to the judge indicating that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled. Everyone who had any connection to the case returned to their seats. The boy was brought from the holding area. His mother was in the gallery. Robert's family was in the gallery. The media was in the gallery. The judge entered and took her seat. The jury entered and took their seats. The foreperson stood when asked if they had reached a verdict. They had. The judge asked for the verdict. On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The word hung in the air. The jury had found the boy guilty of murder. The evidence had been sufficient. The testimony had been sufficient. The forensic evidence had been sufficient. The boy was guilty. The victim's sister put her hand over her mouth. Robert's family members began to cry. The boy's mother made a sound that was something between a cry and a gasp. The boy sat still for a moment. His feet stopped swinging. And then, in that moment of silence, in that moment when the weight of the verdict should have settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket, the boy yawned. It was not a small yawn, not a nervous yawn, a full, open, audible yawn. His mouth opened wide, his head tilted back, his eyes closed. He stretched his arms as though he had just woken up from a nap. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hands. He looked around the courtroom with an expression of mild curiosity, as though he had just awakened from sleep and was wondering where he was. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it was captured in its entirety by the courtroom security cameras. It was witnessed by everyone in the courtroom. It would become the defining image of the trial. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some people stood up involuntarily. Some people began to speak. Robert's sister made a sound that was audible above the noise. The judge's expression changed. It shifted from controlled neutrality to something else entirely. Something that looked like anger. Something that looked like shock. Something that looked like a recognition that she was witnessing something that violated the basic protocols of how a courtroom should function. The judge raised her hand. The courtroom began to quiet. The judge's gavel came down once, hard. The sound echoed through the space. Judge Ashford looked directly at the boy. Her expression was clear. Her anger was evident. She said nothing for a long moment. She simply looked at the child who sat in front of her, the child who had just been found guilty of murder, the child who had yawned as though the entire proceedings were beneath his attention, as though the verdict that had just been read held no significance, as though the family that was grieving on the other side of the courtroom was irrelevant. And then the judge spoke. She said that what had just occurred in her courtroom was unprecedented. She said that the gesture that the boy had made, the yawn, the rubbing of his eyes, the apparent complete indifference to the verdict, revealed something about the defendant's character that was deeply troubling. She said that it demonstrated a level of disconnection from reality that suggested a young person who was incapable of understanding the impact of his actions on others. The judge said that she had presided over many cases involving young defendants. She said that she had seen many children respond to serious charges in many different ways. She said that she had seen children cry. She said that she had seen children appear confused or frightened. She said that she had rarely seen a child respond to a guilty verdict with such complete indifference, such apparent satisfaction, such a complete disconnection from the gravity of what had just been determined. The judge explained that the yawn would not be forgotten. The judge said that the contempt that the boy had displayed would be taken into account when determining an appropriate sentence. The judge said that the gesture revealed something about the boy's character, about his capacity for understanding and empathy, about his fundamental suitability for rehabilitation. The judge said that the words and the gesture were evidence of something that was deeply troubling, that suggested a young person who was incapable of understanding the impact of his actions on others. The judge said that she was immediately postponing the sentencing hearing. The judge said that she needed time to consider what she had just witnessed, to think about how to proceed with a case involving a defendant who seemed so completely unable to comprehend the reality of his situation. The judge said that what had happened in the courtroom would become part of the permanent record. The judge said that it would be documented. The judge said that it would be considered when any decision about sentencing or rehabilitation was made. The judge ordered that the boy be remanded to custody. The judge ordered that the boy have no contact with the media. The judge ordered that the boy not be permitted to make any statements that might be recorded or publicized. The judge was putting limits on the boy's ability to further perform, to further seek attention, to further use the courtroom or any other platform as a stage for whatever psychological needs were driving his behavior. The boy's expression changed. For a moment, he seemed to understand that he had made a serious mistake. For a moment, he seemed to grasp that the gesture, which he had apparently intended to be indifferent or defiant or powerful, had actually revealed something about himself that was deeply damaging. The courtroom was silent. The weight of what had just happened seemed to settle on everyone in the room. A 10-year-old boy had been found guilty of murder. And then, in the moment after the verdict, he had revealed through a single gesture an absence of remorse so profound that it seemed to change the entire nature of the case. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after the verdict. 2 weeks of the boy sitting in juvenile detention, contemplating what had happened, perhaps beginning to understand the magnitude of the consequences that he was about to face. 2 weeks of his mother struggling with the reality of what her son had done, what her son was, what her son would become as a result of his conviction. 2 weeks of the community processing the guilty verdict, processing the yawn, processing the realization that a child from the neighborhood had killed Robert Thompson and had shown no remorse, had shown no understanding, had shown nothing but a kind of detached indifference to the gravity of what he had done. On the day of the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was full again. The media was there. The community was there. Robert's family was there. The boy's family was there. The judge entered and took her seat. The judge looked at the boy. Her expression suggested that she had had time to think about the case, to process what had happened, to consider what was appropriate in terms of a sentence. The prosecutor stood and made his sentencing recommendation. He talked about the severity of the crime. He talked about Robert's life and what had been taken from him. He talked about the evidence of planning and premeditation. He talked about the boy's apparent complete lack of remorse. The prosecutor pointed out that the boy, even after being found guilty of murder, had yawned as if the proceedings were insignificant. The prosecutor argued that this demonstrated a level of psychological dysfunction that was deeply disturbing. The prosecutor recommended a sentence of 25 years, which would mean that the boy would not be eligible for parole until he was in his mid-30s. The defense attorney stood and made arguments about the boy's age. He talked about how young the boy was, about how much development was still happening in his brain, about how his actions might have been the result of confusion or impulse, rather than calculated intent. He talked about the possibility of rehabilitation. He asked the judge to consider the boy's potential for change, his potential for growth, his potential for becoming someone different than the person who had committed the crime. He asked for leniency, for a sentence that would acknowledge the boy's youth, but would also hold him accountable for his actions. Robert's sister stood and read her victim impact statement. She talked about Robert as a person. She talked about his quiet integrity, his reliability, his ability to care for others. She talked about the loss, about the future that had been taken from him. She talked about the fact that a 10-year-old child had killed him and then showed no remorse. She talked about attending his funeral, about the empty space he left in her life, about the grandchildren he would never meet. Her words were powerful and devastating. When she finished, there was absolute silence in the courtroom. Even the boy seemed affected by her words, though his reaction was difficult to interpret. Judge Ashford listened to all of it. And then she spoke. She addressed the boy directly. She said that the boy had committed a terrible crime. She said that the evidence was overwhelming. She said that the boy's apparent lack of remorse was concerning. She said that the gesture that the boy had made after the verdict, the yawn, had revealed something about his character that could not be ignored. She said that she had considered the boy's age carefully. She said that she understood that the boy was young, that the boy's brain was still developing, that there was theoretically a possibility of rehabilitation. But, the judge continued, there was a line that separated childhood mistakes from calculated violence. There was a line between youthful indiscretion and premeditated murder. The judge said that the boy had crossed that line. The judge said that the boy had killed a man who had done nothing to him, who had posed no threat to him, who had simply existed as a neighbor in the same community. The judge said that this act could not be excused by age alone. The judge said that accountability was necessary. The judge said that the community needed to know that there would be consequences for taking another person's life, even if the person taking the life was a child. The judge sentenced the boy to 22 years in prison. The judge said that the boy would not be eligible for parole consideration until he had served at least 18 years. The judge said that during those 18 years, the boy would have the opportunity to develop remorse, to understand what he had done, to become a different person. But the judge made clear that this was not a guarantee. The judge said that if, at the time of the parole hearing, the boy still showed no remorse, still showed no understanding of what he had done, parole could be denied. The judge said that the boy's future, his possibility of ever being released from prison, depended entirely on his capacity to change, to grow, and to develop a genuine understanding of the harm he had caused. The media coverage of the sentencing was extensive. News outlets across the country reported on the case. The focus of the coverage was not just the verdict and the sentence, but the moment after the verdict, the yawn, the gesture that had revealed the boy's complete disconnection from the gravity of his crime. The image of the 10-year-old boy yawning after being found guilty of murder became symbolic. It became a representation of youth disconnected from empathy, of children who seemed incapable of understanding the impact of their actions on others, of the challenge that the justice system faced in dealing with young offenders who displayed such fundamental absence of remorse. Legal scholars began to analyze the case. They discussed the judge's response. They discussed whether the yawn should have been considered evidence of the boy's psychological state. They discussed how courts should treat displays of disrespect during sentencing proceedings. They discussed how the justice system should approach juvenile offenders who showed no remorse. The case became a reference point for discussions about juvenile justice. It was cited in legal arguments. It was discussed in law schools. It was analyzed in psychology courses. The legal community recognized that Judge Ashford had made a decision that was unusual, that had not been clearly articulated in prior legal precedent. By taking the boy's display of contempt into account when determining the sentence, the judge had essentially said that behavior in the courtroom, behavior that revealed the defendant's psychological state and his capacity for empathy, was a legitimate factor in sentencing determinations. The decision would likely be challenged on appeal. But for now, it stood as a kind of watershed moment in how the justice system treated juvenile offenders. Robert's family was left with the permanent reality of his absence. The sister had to process the loss and the strange trauma of knowing that a child, a neighbor, a 10-year-old, had killed the man she had once loved. Robert's nieces and nephews had to process the loss of their uncle and the complicated feelings that came from watching the person who had killed him receive a sentence that allowed for the possibility of parole, that allowed for the possibility that he might someday be free while their uncle was dead, while the void that he had left would never be filled. The community gradually moved past the case. New families moved into houses on Robert Street. The neighborhood recovered from the trauma. But there was something different now. There was an awareness that bad things could happen, that children could commit terrible acts, that suburban safety was not guaranteed. There was a recognition that you couldn't always know what was happening inside the homes around you, that you couldn't always predict who was dangerous and who wasn't, that the normal-looking child could harbor darkness that you never fully understood until it was too late. The boy sat in his cell and grew older. He had years ahead of him, decades perhaps, depending on whether he was ever granted parole, depending on whether he ever demonstrated the kind of change that would convince a parole board that he was safe to release. The yawn that he had made in the courtroom was long ago now, a moment from a different life, a moment from a time when he had thought that his indifference was a kind of power, that his ability to not care was something to be proud of. He had been wrong. He had learned, perhaps, or perhaps he had not. Only he could know the truth of what went on inside his own mind. The courthouse steps where the boy had been photographed being led in restraints were now just steps. The courtroom where the trial had taken place was now just a room. The gallery where Robert's family had sat was now just seating. The spaces where the drama had unfolded had been absorbed back into the ordinary machinery of justice, had become the setting for other cases, other dramas, other stories of crime and consequence. Judge Ashford was asked about the case in an interview some years later. She was asked about the yawn. She said that she had thought about that gesture many times over the years. She said that it was the most revealing moment in the entire trial, that it had shown her something about the boy that no amount of expert testimony could have revealed. She said that the yawn had demonstrated an absence of understanding, an absence of empathy, an absence of any recognition of what he had done. She said that it was the kind of moment that reminded her why the justice system existed, why accountability was necessary, why consequences had to be real and permanent. The case was cited in legal discussions about how juveniles should be treated in the criminal justice system. Some people argued that the boy's sentence was too harsh, that youth should be weighed more heavily in sentencing decisions. Some people argued that the boy's sentence was too light, that the severity of the crime and the apparent lack of remorse should have resulted in a harsher sentence. The case became evidence for different positions in an ongoing debate about how to balance accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation, punishment with the hope for change, the protection of society with the understanding that people could grow and change. The yawn itself had become famous in a way that the boy had never intended. It had become a symbol. It had become a teaching moment. It had become the most famous moment from the trial, more famous than the evidence, more famous than the testimony, more famous than the verdict itself. The image of the 10-year-old boy yawning after being found guilty of murder was an image that stuck with people, that haunted them, that made them think about the nature of youth and responsibility and the ways that sometimes a single gesture could reveal everything about a person. Robert Thompson's memory was preserved in the stories that his family told about him. He was remembered as a quiet man who had lived a good life, who had been a good neighbor, who had deserved better than what had happened to him. He was not remembered primarily as the man who was killed by the 10-year-old boy. He was remembered as a person, as a man with qualities and characteristics and a presence that had meant something to the people who had known him. His life had been cut short, but the impact of his life, the memory of who he had been, remained in the consciousness of the people he had touched. The boy, now growing older in prison, existed in a different kind of memory. He was remembered as the child who had killed his neighbor. He was remembered as the boy who had yawned when he was found guilty. He was remembered as the person who had revealed, through his own actions and gestures, an absence of the basic human capacity for empathy and understanding. Whether that was who he truly was, whether he would ever change, whether he would ever develop a genuine understanding of what he had done, these questions remained unanswered, perhaps permanently unanswered. Perhaps not to be answered until or unless he was released from prison and given the opportunity to demonstrate that he had become someone different than the person he had been. The courtroom where the trial had taken place continued to operate. The judge who had presided over the case continued to hear cases. The prosecutors continued their work. The community continued forward. And somewhere in a prison cell, a young man sat with the consequences of choices he had made when he was 10 years old. He had wanted to be free from consequences. He had achieved the opposite. He was free from nothing. He was bound by his actions, by his choices, by the yawn that had revealed his true nature to everyone who was watching. The gavel had fallen. The trial was over. The sentence was served. And the yawn, once made, could never be unmade. It existed now in the permanent record of the case, in the memories of everyone who had witnessed it, in the digital archives of courtroom video, in the consciousness of a community that had been touched by the terrible reality that violence could come from anywhere, that evil was sometimes smaller and younger than people expected, that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who understood so little about the harm they caused that they seemed genuinely satisfied when they caused it. The judge's words echoed through the years, and for the first time, he truly listened. Whether those words would ever become true, whether the boy would ever truly understand what he had done, remained an open question. But the gavel had fallen, justice had been served, and accountability, though late and incomplete, had been established. In a world where evil sometimes wore the face of a child, in a moment where a single yawn had spoken louder than any words could speak, the system had worked. The truth had prevailed, and the consequence, though it would take decades to fully understand, had been delivered.